Good afternoon, one and all. It gives me immense pleasure that Dr. Amina Wadud has agreed to speak on our forum, Association of Indian Research Scholars. We have been active since September 2020 and have successfully hosted eminent scholars including Professor Noam Chomsky, Professor Joseph Nye, Professor Hargopal, Rajan Harshe, Zoya Hassan, Afroz Alam, Muhammad Mozam Ali, among others. We have also released two newsletters which included not just the webinar reports but also opinion pieces by research scholars from across India. If you have any piece you want to publish, consider sending it to us on official mail ID. We also are available on all social media platforms. Do connect with us, share, like, and subscribe for updates and notifications. This is a special day for me as this is a very big event for our association. We have four discussants and an incredible moderator, Dr. K. Sai Amulya, who has kindly agreed to moderate today's session on such a relevant topic. Now let me introduce myself. My name is Ariba Asanat Mogam and I am the President of Association of Indian Research Scholars. Let me first introduce the speaker followed by the moderator and the discussant. As you all know, Dr. Amina Wadud is a scholar of eminence. She is known across the world. So I don't think she needs any introduction as such, but let me give a few lines and brief introduction about her. She is an Islamic scholar who has progressive focus on Quran or the interpretation of the holy text. She writes extensively on the role of women in Islam. She received a PhD in Arabic and Islamic Studies from University of Michigan in 1988. You must be wondering why she writes her name in the small letter, because I was not aware of it till I actually tried finding the reason. So this is what I have come to understand, that the Arabic alphabet does not recognize capital letters, and that is why she prefers to write her name in the small letter. Her work majorly focuses on gender and Islam. She has wrote one of the most prominent books that we all know, Quran and Women, reading the sacred text from a woman's perspective, which has become a seminal work on the topic. And she is also part of several civil society organizations and movements that promote principles of equality for women under the principles of Islam, such as Sisters in Islam and Musawa. Uh, the moderator for today is Dr. K. Sai Amulya Pomaraju, who is the senior sector leader at FemLab Co. She is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Development Management and Communication, MICA, Ahmedabad. She is also the recipient of 6-month research grant from Southern Center for Inequality Studies that fosters innovative research on the role of digital technologies in reshaping the world of workers in the global south. Next on our panel, who's discussant is Dr. Amina Hussain, who's an assistant professor at the Department of English and Modern Europe and Asian Languages, Khwaja Moinuddin Christie Language University, Lucknow. We also have with us Ajmal Sameer, who is a research scholar at the Usmania University in the Department of English, Hyderabad. Uh, we are also joined by S.K. Sagir Ali, who is an assistant professor at the Department of English, Midnapur College, West Bengal, India. Lastly, we have a young scholar, Tanya Arifli, who uh, pursued her MA from St. Xavier's University, and she is presently working on a B.Ed, I think, from Alia University. So, with this, uh, I uh, ask ma'am to lead us into the discussion, and over to you, ma'am.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I begin as I always begin in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. So I will be sharing with you from several different topics. I will just sort of do a brief kind of overview of my location with regard to the topic, and then we'll have discussion. So I'm not going to try to cover everything that we agreed on in one part. It just is easier for me and also allows me to be a little bit more spontaneous with regard to the process, which is always interesting for me. So the first topic that I will discuss is Islamic feminism. And because I have only been able to use the word feminism with regard to myself for about 11 or 12 years, very specific. I kind of look at my process as a nice shoe-in for understanding, some of the confusion that exists with regard to it. First of all, the notion that the term feminism starts in the West, in the global North, I think is an accurate reflection of its overall history. And the definition that I like to use for feminism comes from Simone de Beauvoir, a French feminist philosopher, who said feminism is the radical idea that women are human beings. And that may sound um, sort of a bit overexpression, except that if you trace back the history of philosophical, religious, and political discourse across history, you will notice that there are places where the perception of who is a human being is based on the male human as if it is the same in application to the female human. Now, I'm going to work within this binary until, later on, just to make a certain number of points originally. But the reality is women and men differ not only in terms of certain basic biology, but most importantly, in terms of the ways in which their identities are constructed by their societies, by culture, and other, forces around us. And so I do not collapse the term male with masculine exclusively and comprehensively. And I do not collapse the term female with feminine exclusively and comprehensively. By that I mean there is masculine and feminine aspects that manifest in all things. And in humans, we are so much more complex. We have masculine attributes because it helps us to assert ourselves, it helps us to be active, it helps us to get things done. It even helps us to prioritize our own personal location. But we also all have feminine attributes. And these are more receptive, but they also tend to be more relational. However, if we take human beings and we pretend that only female bodies are feminine and only masculine bodies are masculine, or that every male is masculine in every way, we will deny ourselves some important operating components of the human makeup. So when I affirm the definition given by Simone de Beauvoir about, our full human beings, I then, as a Quranic and Islamic scholar, go into the sources for understanding what it means to be a human being that are part of our intellectual and spiritual legacy. So I construct the notion of the human being from the Quran. And in the Quran, there are certain key passages that helps us to understand, what is the teleology, what is the purpose for humans. For example, when the Quran says, "Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa," I will create on the earth an agent, a moral agent. A human being is one who has free will and the capacity to be able to follow that free will up, especially in order to establish what we know as the way of God. So we are agents of Allah's divine design, and the place where we exercise that agency is on the earth, fil ard. We don't have a notion of a fall to the earth. That's not our breakdown of that cosmology. And to say that this is what it means to be human Sometimes people ask me, well, what is the role of woman in Islam? And I say her role is to be a khalifa, that is to be an agent of the divine way. So when I look across all the aspects of Islamic teleology and personhood, I see that the Quran makes distinctions with regard to persons, but the distinctions are not evaluated such that one is greater than or less than, but simply it is an affirmation of the diversity and the beauty of humans, and that each of us have within us the capacity to aspire to excellence, what the Sufis call al-insan al-kamil, to perfect our own being so that the time that we spend on the earth will in fact help us to best fulfill that purpose, that of being agents. Taking this notion of humanity for me and putting it in alignment with the notion of Tawheed, which is the fundamental principle of Islam, the understanding of Allah's oneness, but also the understanding of Allah's uniqueness. So, for example, the Quran says, "Laysa kamithlihi shay'un," that Allah is not like shay, like things. And the Quran also says, "Min kulli shay'in khalaqna zawjayn." From all things, we have created the pair. So Allah cannot be masculine or feminine because Allah cannot be male or female because Allah is not like the things that are divided into those categories, but rather Allah has both masculine and feminine attributes, the Jamal and the Jalal, according to the 99 names. But as an operating principle, Allah is also sublime, and we say, Allahu Akbar, Allah is the greatest. So if Allah is the greatest, it means that none is comparable to Allah. And if we construct a system where one person is estimated in worth over another person, that's a kind of satanic logic. So for me, hegemony is a kind of vertical line of understanding, which in fact was quite popular in the construction of Islamic basic paradigms. There was an overwhelming understanding that if any two things came together, one of them must be on top, in charge, or better. But for me, with the rubric of Tawheed, nothing is above except for Allah, and that means that humans end up falling on a horizontal line of reciprocity. So myself and another are equal in our humanity. It is true that the Quran also evaluates humans on the basis of their moral excellence. Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum, that the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the one with the most taqwa, with taqwa being a level of consciousness that necessarily requires an application in certain kinds of moral actions. So again, agency. So if we take this notion of moral consciousness, awareness, and belief in Allah as an operating principle from which to operate, then that means that all actions that are performed with the intention of their integrity towards Allah and Allah's creation fall into the category of good, and all actions that are performed in order to create harm in the same way would be considered to be bad or evil or wrong. And so that's kind of a loose construct. But within that construct, what came to me as being important is that there is fundamentally and necessarily an equality and reciprocity between male and female, between women and men, that has nowhere been in manifestation. But the way that I work towards it is through an affirmation of this kind of worldview. And that's what brought me to feminism 11 years ago. After having debated strongly with those assertions of feminism that still exist, that require of me that I distance myself from my religion, from my spiritual orientation, from my connection or my belief in a transcendent reality, the ultimate reality called Allah. I couldn't operate that way, so I didn't. But it occurred to me within the last 15 years or so that that's not the singular definition of feminism. However, there is such a thing as secular feminism, and secular feminism belongs to whoever chooses that orientation, male, female, Muslim, and others. And when I was at the Beijing World Conference in 1995, there was a huge divide between two competing voices and perspectives. And one was the voice of secular feminism. And secular feminism took control over every feminism. Like, if you're a feminist, you must be like us. And obviously, I wasn't going to give up my religion for them. So, I said I'm not a feminist. But the other competing voice, which had been slowly building up its power base globally, was the voice of Islamist Islam, Muslim women and men who were present, who basically said that Islam is all we need. It's the best. We don't need anybody else's, worldview or perspective on any issue. And yet, the two of them, when they got together, agreed with each other on one thing, and that is, you cannot have both Islam and feminism. And over the years, about 10 years following, that event, it became really clear to me that the way feminism was being designed to exclude Islam was only secular feminism and not comprehensive, and that the way that Islam was being described was only patriarchal and hegemonic. In order for there to be the meeting between Islam and feminism to make Islamic feminism, we had to take agency to redefine both feminism and Islam, and then Islamic feminism was born. So the reality is that people are still located on the feminism, the spectrums of feminisms. Some are secular and Muslim, some are secular and not Muslim, some are secular and anti-Muslim. But some are Muslim and they're more like liberal feminists, because liberal feminists use whatever method they can to achieve the equality that should be inherent in every created person, and particularly to raise women to the level of equality that they've been denied. But Islamic feminism is very clear that the basis for and the methodology of its promotion of equality comes from Islamic sources. So basing my notion on equality in a perception of Tawheed as a paradigm that helps to operate at the level of justice and equality for all is Islamic in origin and in projection. So while I am Muslim and now feminist, I only became a feminist when I could help to construct the understanding of Islamic feminism as both an affirmation of my faith and my humanity, and a movement towards the equality for all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wadud, for deliberating on what Islamic feminism means and tying it back to your personal experiences. We have Mr. Sameed who has a question for you. Sameed, if you could please unmute yourself and direct your question to Dr. Wadud.
Hello, madam. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Madam, I wanted to ask you how feminism in Saudi Arabia differs from other Gulf and Middle Eastern countries.
I didn't hear you. Could you slow down a little bit? There's a little bit of a fuzz in your voice, so the words are not separate.
How feminism in Saudi Arabia is different from other Gulf and Middle Eastern countries like Kuwait or Dubai and Lebanon, Jordan, like
Okay, so I think you said feminism in Saudi Arabia, which I think is an interesting specificity. So let me just jump in to say, as the discourse over feminisms increases in the context of Islam and Muslims, one of the things that we will notice is that we are located in a diversity of perspectives. And you can also plot this out a little bit regionally, but I don't, I mean, I will overgeneralize just for the sake of, this conversation. And that is that in the Arabic-speaking world, most of the MENA region and the Levant, the term feminism is not very popular, and in some cases, it is considered negative. And then in South Asia regions, feminism is predominantly secular, and secularism, no matter how you define it, because that's an issue as well, secularism is a component of feminism. I live in Southeast Asia. I live in Indonesia, and in this part of the world, and in places, for example, like South Africa and other parts of Africa, there's a much more dynamic understanding of the spectrum and meanings of feminism, so that one is more likely to affirm one's identity as Muslim and feminist without any backlash, the way it will still happen in certain parts of the world. So the one thing that you need to know is that feminism is very personal, with affects that are very regional and local. In other words, when I was in the US as a Black American woman, the dominant white feminism did not speak to the intersectionality of my reality and the multiple ways of oppression and disenfranchisement. So it was not the answer to where I needed to go if I was looking for an affirmation of my full humanity. And for me, the other element, as I mentioned earlier, was faith or spirituality. So you can't determine the feminism of person A just because they're standing next to person B and they both affirmed, their own feminist identities, because it is diverse. But there are these wide swaths of application, from secular feminism to, sort of pro-faith feminism to liberal feminism, which is, kind of an eclectic modality. And so the feminists that I know from Saudi Arabia are either Muslim or Islamic feminists. They are not secular, and they are not they're not Islamist. The thing about Islamism and political Islam is that it comprehensively presumes that men are superior, and it comprehensively presumes that anything that comes from the West is going to be bad. And so it's difficult to even have a conversation about something like democracy. I am not on either one of those camps of secular or Islamist, but understanding the nature of the hybridity for me was something that was worked out working in with organizations like Musawa or the Sisters in Islam from Malaysia, who had a pro-faith, pro-feminist agenda for about 30 years. So I didn't have the history of Saudi Arabia in my mind, but I just want to say there are regional differences, and these affect how it is that people define and can participate in feminism according to those locations. Some places are more open, and some places it's problematic.
thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank
Wadud.
you.
Thank you so much, Sameed. Dr. Amina has a question for you. Dr. Amina, if you could please.
You're still mute.
Dr. Amina, you're on mute. Could you please unmute yourself? Thank you.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum. First of all, I want to state it's an honor to share my name with you and a privilege to hear you live. And also because your work, especially Quran and women, has been, it has been seminal to my own understanding, and also professionally, in my thesis, which was on Muslim women in diaspora. At a personal level, ma'am, I want to say and share that as a devout Muslim woman, I have often struggled to actually come to an understanding of a lot of things which I seem to defend in my piety, but I'm not able to personally justify. So your work it has spoken to me, your approach, your methodology, and it has definitely helped me. It has spoken to me at various levels, personally and now professionally. So I do have, actually I have a couple of questions, but I do not want to encroach upon others' time. So I want to first of all ask you that, do you think that Islamism, that has previously marginalized women, has now almost paradoxically encouraged and motivated, and especially I'm talking about the middle class, educated, traditional women, into a social, political, and religious activism? And here, would you credit Islamic feminism to it? And also, I want to specifically point out a movement, the Al Huda movement. You have Al Huda, schools all over the world, and spearheaded by Farhat Hashmi, Dr. Farhat Hashmi, and they have centers even in India. And I myself was part of it for a brief period of time. And these Al Huda centers seems to unconditionally and absolutely, unchallengedly, they accept the mainstream patriarchal version or reading or interpretation of Islam, but at the same time, they're able to organize women into groups and channelize their support and solidarity in creating an identity and asserting themselves vis-a-vis the Western, concept of identity. So that has played. So in that ways, how do you see Islamic feminism? So I have lots of questions, but I think this has been a long one. So I would like to have your response before I move on to another one, if it is allowed.
Okay, so one of the things I think we need to understand is that the interpretation of Islam within the binary hegemony, which is patriarchy, was pretty comprehensive, even though patriarchy did not start with Islam, and it isn't particularly Islamic, especially based on the way in which I read Tawheed. However, because Islam is populated by people, and people were overwhelmingly patriarchal, it has made its way into the canon of Islam, and we have to unpack it. Now, let me tell you something about the unpacking, because it's really very interesting. So, for example, working on the Quran as a linguistic field, a field of thought, of words and meaning, having as their indication and implication the practical application of those meanings, working only along those lines before I even started, thinking about feminism really, I came to demonstrate how you can either continually encode hegemony, so top to bottom, or you can encode equality and reciprocity, sometimes out of the exact same text. And so what you need is a perspective that helps you to confirm the equality and reciprocity, which again for me turns out to be I call the Tawhidic paradigm, and I've written about it quite extensively. So it is first of all necessary to understand that the dominant interpretation of Islam for all kinds of fields of thought has been patriarchal. You can find it in Tasawwuf or Sufism, you can find it in philosophy, you can find it in exegesis, and you especially find it in fiqh or jurisprudence. And of course, jurisprudence is put in application and has been across time And when it's put in application, it is both created by, but also creates a certain kind of cultural milieu. And in that cultural milieu, people often say, well, that's Islam. Later on, when I talk about, some aspects of, the women's movement, I will help you to understand what the political implications of having control over the term Islam like this does. But because we are still in the post-colonial tension of the dominant, and by that I mean political and economic dominance of certain Western powers, and those Western powers are steeped in their own Islamophobic locations. Whenever we are searching for the authenticity of our own identity and our own strength center, we go back to Islam, because Islam predated the modern nation state and the colonial rise of power, et cetera, et cetera. We go back to it as a kind of sort of personal affirmation and empowerment. The problem is we tend to go back not examining really the baggage that has come along because of the predominance of patriarchy, again, not exclusive to and not original to Islam, but because of patriarchy, it has really shaped the way we understand so much. So as an act of empowerment, you will find people, including, women such as yourself, we align ourselves with Islam because that's our heritage and that's our motivation, both in this life and the next life. But we should not do this without examining who is using the word Islam and how they're using it. And I think in the 21st century, with the rise of Daesh or ISIS, it has given all of us some clarity that not everyone who says they are speaking in the name of Islam is someone with whom we agree. And if we take this idea of righteous disagreement along the lines of the gendered discourse, we will take issue with a lot of locations. And for me, not only is that absolutely okay, it is absolutely necessary. And the reason, again, for me is theological. I do think in theological terms. For me to return to my Lord, as is inevitable, whether today or tomorrow or sometime in the future, to Allah we all belong, to Allah we will return. For me to return to my Lord, trying as I can with the best of the agency or khilafah that Allah has given me while I'm alive, to establish justice, peace, and human dignity, I have to resist the control over the notion of Islam that tends to fall along this patriarchal lines. So it is possible to have Islam without patriarchy. It doesn't exist now, but we can work towards it, because this location, this hegemonic location where, any two who come together, one has to be on top, that's a choice. Two can come together and they can just be in an exchangeable, horizontal line of equality, mirroring the realities of each other's soul's journey, et cetera, et cetera. That's a choice as well. So I'm always going to choose, reciprocity and equality. And now, unlike even in my own past, as I was writing that book more than 30 years ago, now I understand that I have that choice, and that I have that choice with an affirmed faith location. I don't have to go outside. It doesn't mean I don't work with others, with other locations on similar issues like eradication of violence against women. I can work with a secular person to eradicate violence against women, but I can only work from a faith location, right? So the whole issue of claiming the identity of Islam when Islam is under siege from certain powers, it does empower other Muslims, male and female, and they can be galvanized to work together to have a movement, like, as you explained, Al-Huda. So it is possible for people to work under, let's just say Allah knows best, but let's just say they're working under the niyyah of the affirmation of the best that they know, and the best that they know is Islam. But the idea that needs to be clear is whose Islam, how are they defining it, on what basis are they defining it, and is that the only definition? And most of the time you will see that there are multiple definitions, and some of the definitions of Islam I just don't agree with.
Thank you, ma'am, so much. Just carrying it forward on a more semantic level. In in your book Quran and Women, you maintain that the male ijtihadic tradition does not seem to distinguish between the text and interpretation. So I just have this out of curiosity. When we do a gendered reading or a feminist interpretation, are we also not falling into the same, trying to form a totalitarian meaning? So how do we resolve this binary, so as to say? And also, ma'am, one more question. In an academic discourse on Islamic feminism, another category has been, made, which is pitted against Islamic feminism, and you have been very careful in not using that word, but I have come across it many a time. It's called Muslim feminism. So, if it is a nascent, or is it not entirely secular Muslim women? So what do you make of it? And as a devout practicing Muslim woman, how do I respond or react to the Western feminist projection of somehow ridiculing or dismissing Islamic feminism as mutually exclusive, or, as you have mentioned elsewhere, like an oxymoron? And there are too many questions put together.
Yes, there are. So I have to take notes because I was so interested to answer the first one, which I now have to remember what it was.
I just don't want
yes.
to leave this.
So absolutism. It's really interesting that so people say to me things like, well, you're reading equality into the Quran, and I say absolutely. And in fact, I advocate that if you have choices between a more egalitarian interpretation and a patriarchal one, you choose the egalitarian on purpose. So first, let's clear that up. I am not trying to pretend that I am answering for everyone and everything, but I am trying to say that choosing equality when you already have a history that has demonstrated that patriarchal interpretations not only exist, but can dominate is a methodology, to choose equality. However, I'm not an absolutist. I'm absolutely not an absolutist. No, I believe in the nuance, and I believe when the Quran says, argue with them with what is best. That if you have a good argument for something, even if it's something that I had not understood or agreed with in the past, that it makes more sense to provide the evidence for the location that you're going to have. So in other words, I'm not just going to take an opinion just to take an opinion. I am going to, and I will expect evidence to support the benefits of that particular location. In other words, I will reason myself with you with regard to how we might best understand a matter. And that is not comprehensive. That is not something that, leads to any absolute conclusion. And so I don't believe that we are trying to say, okay, well, let me just put it this way. Equality, justice, and human dignity are not conditional. Those are my absolutes. The idea that I might have to contend with a hegemonic location and or interpretation for Islam is something that I would be standing against. But other than standing for those types of principles and virtues, which coincidentally I get from the Quran, is not for me the same thing as saying everybody has to believe exactly as I believe on everything that I believe. That that's not my location. And for the academic, yes, I use Islamic feminism for my own location. I am Muslim, so therefore I am Muslim feminist. But I distinguish between secular feminism, which there are secular Muslim feminists. I have worked with them and argued with them and been argued against by them. And there are secular feminists who are not Muslim, and that comes into your next question, so I'll come back to it again. But there are also Muslim feminists who are for all the things that I'm for: equality, justice, human dignity, and the like. And they have acquired their feminism from a collection of discourses about human rights and dignity, or about women, women's human rights, and the like. And so their methodology isn't as, I should say, tediously Islamic as the methodology that I use. My methodology is based actually on Islamic theology, and it is gleaned from Islamic sources, but it promotes those sources without the cumbersome nature of the patriarchal interpretations, that have existed. And that means that Islamic feminism is a knowledge-based location along the spectrums of feminism. And the knowledge is in particular from Islam, Islamic intellectual legacy, Islamic primary sources, Islamic worldview. And so you can actually be an Islamic feminist and not be Muslim. So that's a real contentious little thing. I don't want to get further afield in it. But I don't use the word Muslim feminism because it doesn't distinguish between the ability to use all types of methodologies to arrive at your goal. And for me, especially my location as a theologian, where my feminism stems specifically from my understanding of Islam and is based on Islamic sources and will be promoted that way. But every consideration of myself as a Muslim who is an Islamic feminist also means I'm a Muslim feminist. But I do want to make that distinction when I just sort of have a conversation about Islamic feminism, because using it that way is a recent, it's sort of a hybrid. There were Muslim feminists, all the way back in the 20th century, and they, went with the dominant notion of feminism, and they contended with the secularism and eventually the Islamophobia. They contended with that as they went along. I didn't have to contend with those because I never accepted feminism until I could define it for myself based on my faith affirmation. Oh, so the third one. In the world of hegemonies, oppressions, and other forms of domination, colonialism being, principle one, we all know that the status of Muslim women was used as fodder in the West to allow them to do other types of atrocities. We all know this, but we also, I think, are holding on to that as if, number one, that's the only thing that exists from the West, and number two, we have not empowered ourselves, represented ourselves, claimed our own identities in any way since this happened. And I think we need to let go of that monkey from our back. Western feminists are still pervasive. They still can have the tendency to believe and assert that they have the absolute and exclusive ownership over feminisms. And my thing is, if feminism belongs to you and only you, you can keep it, because I'm still going to do the work that I do, and I'm still going to invest in this life with my perspective of this life and the next life working together. So I'm not wedded to competing with them in any way, shape, or form. But I know that it still happens that you get into certain localities and there is an arrogance, sort of presumption of the privilege that belongs to Western feminists, as if they and they alone are the makers of feminism. and you can't do anything with it. But then they don't know how to deal with someone within the ranks of early secular feminists, by the way, Simone de Beauvoir. I mean, she's from France. It's probably the worst secular, location that we know about today. And that is to say that feminism is the radical idea that women are human beings. Once you say that, then the next question is, well, what does it mean to be a human being? Which, again, as I said, for me, that is derived from Islamic sources. Unless you have to deal with them on a daily basis, I really believe that your most empowered location is to just ignore them. And the reason why that's your most empowered location is because the contention of the matter of gender equality in all of our societies is a big enough problem that trying to either justify or even to contend with a bunch of exclusivist feminists is low on the radar. Like, they're not important. I think my sister, Linda Sarsour, a public activist, Muslim Palestinian woman, said in the US, I can work along with you as long as you're not going to deny me my own identity. I think she got it from Malcolm X. But, the reality is the affirmation of equality, justice, and dignity within our specific context is a huge task to which we need to apply the best of our energy. To give energy off to the naysayers and the haters, including Western secular feminists who pretend that they and they alone have the ownership of feminism, that's their problem, and they need to get it together. But they're not going to get any energy from me, because there is enough to do to work for justice, equality, and dignity that taking aside my energy to work at that level of ignorance, unfortunately, is no longer on my agenda. I also don't work with, sorry to say, I don't work with extremist conservatives. It's just like, you know what, we've been out here having these conversations now for, 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And if you still try to say, you can't be feminist and Muslim, go read a book. I mean, I can't do one-on-one every time I'm trying to engage. So I don't think that you should put Western feminist on your agenda. I think if you focus on establishing your own identity and your own agenda with regard to that identity, that is, as a Muslim woman, what is your purpose in life, and how do you make application of that purpose to your own circumstances, that takes up so much energy, and also you are more likely to participate in it with love. And love is so powerful, it's so reinvigorating, that when you spend your time arguing against people who argue because they have some other location and they're not really open in the discourse, it's exhausting and you get so little satisfaction. I just feel like, maybe this is because I'm an old woman now and I'm looking towards the grave. I just feel like I'm not going to give my energy to them at all. Really.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wadud, for explaining that the burden of challenging the notion that Islamic feminism is an oxymoron should not fall on Islamic feminists. If there are no questions, if we could move to the next topic as well. Thank you so much.
Okay, so one of the topics that I elected to talk about is, of course, I think I said the women's mosques movement, and I think that that's as good a place as any to kind of start talking about another tier, really, of my life's journey. And part of that is deconstructing the notions of authority as they have been promoted, especially in confessional Muslim spaces. So the idea is that certain people have authority. Usually any male person is presumed to have authority just because he's a male person. And again, all of this is based on that hegemony. But also this notion that as far as Islam as a ritual, intensive, spiritual system Islam has those who are the only ones who are permitted to be able to do certain things. That's not our location. Our location is that everyone has an opportunity to serve Allah, and we serve Allah according to the fiqh or jurisprudence in both ibadah, which is sort of spiritual worship or deeds, and mu'amala, which is human interaction, social systems, politics, economies, art, etc., etc. So we serve in both these capacities, and hopefully there's a uniformity in our being with regard to each. But it used to be that there were these categorical assertions that only men could perform in certain, what used to be called leadership roles. And particularly with regard to the sacred devotions. And the justification for that is constructed or contrived. I don't know if I want to use that word, but the justification for it is constructed without the kinds of, remember what I said about, getting evidence, what's your argument and what's the evidence for your argument? What's your position? What's your location? How do you, how do you verify that? What's your evidence? There's no verse in the Quran that says that women cannot lead prayer, for example. And there's no verse in the Quran that says it must be a man who leads prayer. There's no hadith on the Prophet that said women cannot lead prayer, or that said only men can lead prayer. So where did it come from? It's just so interesting, because I have to be honest, the first time I was asked to do something like this in 1994 in South Africa, I myself thought it was, sort of outside the scope, that we were pushing the boundaries. Well, we were only pushing the boundaries of the community's acquiescence to the confirmation of superiority of men over women. And what place is higher to do that except in the area of our devotions, our spiritual practices, the things that help us to affirm our realities as not just corporal beings, but also spiritual beings, right? So that's the place of sort of esoteric authority or sort of arbitrarily coming into place. And once it's put into place for, hundreds of years, we just didn't question it. And yet the question has come up in the classical tradition. It's been considered in some of the traditional schools of law, and even though the majority opinion was not for it, there are still some opinions in favor of it. So as this opportunity to break the hegemony of the old forms of authority, both in thought and in practice, and in this case spiritual or ritual practice, as it came forward, there were certain marginalized and subaltern parts of our community that really took hold of this as a way to be able to realign their own spiritual center with their spiritual goal or aspiration. And interestingly enough, the beginning of this was amongst queer Muslims. Now, queer Muslims, by which I mean LGBTQI, the full spectrum, queer Muslims have come out of the 20th century with a very interesting and resounding message. And that message was, you cannot be Muslim and queer. Can't be Muslim and gay, can't be Muslim and bisexual, you can't, etc. Now, about the time when this conversation was ready to take a radical turn in the road is also when I became connected to, queer Muslim communities. And I use the word queer because I myself identify as queer for reasons of politics and spirituality that, if you're interested, I'll tell you later. But this is my chosen community. And the reason why I think it has become so important to me as it impacts on the, the women's mosque movements, the reason why it's been so important to me is because the desire for realigning identities with their spiritual trajectory, I have never seen demonstrated more strongly than amongst those, non-cis hetero Muslims who were trying to reclaim spiritual practice, spiritual identities, and the like. And I found something very moving to be in those spaces. There was such a momentum for the claiming of the spirit. And of course, I've been, blacklisted, and, the takfirs are, having a heyday with me, all that kind of stuff. But I have never personally felt pushed back to the extent to which I really felt like I had to choose my Islam or my identity, my sexual identity, my gender identity, my sexual orientation, my gender orientation, my race, etc. I've never been pushed back to the extent to which that was happening. And the momentum that was built around reclaiming sacred space and sacred practices led to the construction of what's called the inclusive mosque initiatives. And the Inclusive Mosque Initiative, some groups have that as their proper name, but the whole notion about inclusive sacred space and sacred practice has taken root, has spread, and I used to tell them, if you build it, they will come. But the basic notion is this. If Muslims are required to pray 5 times a day, every day, and everybody has the same requirement, if you are establishing the collective experience, the jama'ah, if you are establishing the collective experience around what is already individually an imperative, how do you manage the shared space? Do you then resort back to these different forms of hegemony? Or do you practice a way that equalizes, formalizes, but equalizes the significance of every participant? Every participant. So in inclusive spaces, they've made an asserted effort to not only permit, but also encourage each of the congregants to assume the role of imam, to assume the role of, that is to lead the prayer, to assume the role of khatib, that is to give sermons before certain sacred events, and to line up in accordance to the order of shoulder to shoulder, but by no other criteria. And that includes differently abled bodies being a part of the prayer line. So the unity that's struck by having the lines is still maintained, but the lines are not divided by men's lines in the front and women's lines in the back. And then the one who is, for me, the functionary of leading prayer is a functional term. It's not a hierarchical term. But the functionary leader is the one who helps to organize the movements for the collective, because there's a beauty in that unity, but it doesn't have to be hegemonic. On the heels of the assertions of creating spaces, there's also some interesting dialogue about, what it means, these sacred spaces. What happens if you, for example, in the diaspora, where you don't have the resources to build a mosque from the ground up, you may start a Friday meeting that's in your your service room related to your job. You just bring together Muslims and you pray in that space. But that space is going to be equally accessible to all kinds of bodies that want to participate, and that each of the participants are also welcome to help to structure and organize that worship by fulfilling the roles that heretofore were taken as authoritative or leadership. So this is a function of the way Islam as a minority tradition has worked in the global north. And these are the places where the beginnings of the efforts for women's mosques took root. And women's mosques were places that were centered on women, and in some cases even exclusive to women, but nevertheless still allowing for women to perform in multiple functions or roles related to the organization of the devotional act in its performance by women. So women khadibas, women calling the prayer, women leading the prayer, et cetera, et cetera. And these have increased, some with more levels of success than others, but these have increased and they have also spread into no longer Muslim minority, but also Muslim majority situations. So I live here in Indonesia, and in Indonesia, they are one of the most inclusive places for women's worship. You can't go to a shopping mall without having a mosque, a prayer place on the floor, of the great mosque. I'm sorry, the great malls, and there will be women's and men's, and like they have access for both women and men, and they always have access for both. But in the functions of the community, there were certain ways in which, for example, if they created a women's only space, they could not use the word masjid. They could use sarau, which is another one for like a small mosque, but they couldn't use the word masjid. But I know a woman here who's been the head of her Islamic boarding school since her husband passed away, who was the head of it. He was the kiai and she was the niai. And now the niai is the head of the whole boarding school with like 6,000 students. And she is building a mosque, a beautiful mosque from the ground up, and it is the women's mosque, Masjid Perempuan. That's already a coup, because again, there are these inadvertent methods put into place to reduce. So it's, on the one hand, there's inclusion in Indonesia, but on the other hand, there's this kind of reduction to say that, the women's sacred space is not quite the full sacred space. The full sacred space must have men, and men must be the imams, et cetera, et cetera. So I am happy to see that, again, for me, that which distinguishes our particular journey in life as Muslims, and that is a relationship to the source of our reality, the Creator, Allah. A relationship with Allah includes certain acts of devotion, and those acts of devotion have also been encoded with patriarchal or hegemonic reading, and eventually we never looked at them as constructs. We took them to be sacred, but they're not. They are other manifestations or reflections of the same patriarchy that has impacted everyone in the world and the earth and natural resources as well. So the women's mosque movement now includes more and more women who are acting as imams and khatibas, giving the Friday sermon and leading prayer, as well as the construction of spaces in which women will be imams and khatibas. When the previous century, we didn't see such spaces. So there's more and more formal and informal spaces that are coming together. And I'm happy to have lived to not only see this happen, but to be a part of its happening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wadud. I have a quick question, so I must apologize to Tanya, who's supposed to lead the discussion now. There are studies in India, including my own doctoral research, where I looked at how people understand feminism. So this is sort of addressing both of your talks, the first Islamic feminism and inclusive mosque movement. So a lot of upper class, middle class feminist women who I spoke with differentiated themselves from lower class Muslim women whose experiences of exploitation and oppression are far different from what they experience. They have the choice, they have a right to choice, whether it's about hijab or sexuality. So I was wondering if you could speak to the class or other kinds of privilege that makes this sort of inclusive mosque movement possible? What kind of privilege should women have so that they can lead congregational prayers? Or is that related at all?
So the reality of class divides, I must say, first of all, is not something for which I can say that I have done enough study to feel confident to answer all aspects of it. But with regard to its alignment with either the choice to use the term feminism and the choice to be able to construct sacred spaces, that are inclusive. This is not what is occurring in the places that I am most familiar with in terms of these inclusive spaces, which is the US, South Africa, and the UK. They exist in other places, as I said, I know a few lady imams from Germany, and I know women who have acted as imams, here in Indonesia, and in certain select places, whether or not there's an initiative for a space to continually practice in that way. The class divide does not come in because the participants are working from an intersectional perspective. However, the reality for all of us is that when you have the resources, you have more access, you have more privileges, and coincidentally, you also are afforded opportunities to pursue alternative interpretations to lead to the diverse applications. So if there were to be, in my mind, one comprehensive factor that is related to class that impacts on the development of inclusive spaces and Islamic feminism, that factor would be education. Access to education is not universal and it is not uniform, but it has continued to prove itself to continually disenfranchise subaltern people on the basis of race and class and ethnicity and gender and gender identities and the like. But it is not in and of itself a feature of those who have been working for inclusive spaces, and instead it is included in the means for helping to sustain those spaces as inclusive. So, for example, this is like different from class per se, but IMI, the Inclusive Mosque Initiative in the UK, which is over a decade old, they have an explicit formula for making sure that the spaces that they inhabit are accessible to all persons, no matter their level of ability or not. They also pay for, and this is how it is that money comes into the, or finances or resources comes into it, but they pay for a sign language interpreter. So there are facilities towards inclusion that require resources, and we have all kinds of crowdfunding methods that we become aware of, especially with the way the cyberspace is in use. But the disadvantage of not having those resources means that it's slow. But the reality is, in my experience with these, it has been slow because it's always being done on a voluntary basis. And so far, so this is the coup, so far, it's not the rich that have been our primary supporters. They haven't been the one creating the spaces or promoting the alternatives. They may participate, but they haven't been the one to say, I'm going to give this endowment for this inclusive. So even the Masjid Perempuan here, the women's mosque, as I said, she's running a school with 6,000 students. And that may just be the ones who are in residence. She also has like, they have evening programs and weekend programs and day programs and daycare programs. So they have, you know, there's a lot of people that come through there. But she's building that mosque from the resources that she has available to her. So the building is a little bit on the slow side. It takes some time when you don't have the means to be able to, you know, throw all your money at it the way they do when they built the biggest mosque in all of Asia, which somehow I've been to several countries that love to be able to say they have the biggest mosque with the highest minaret or whatever it is. So there's resources. But the resources have not been available. Sometimes working on the women's movement, especially working with Musawa, I just think to myself, all we need is one Saudi princess to endow us, you know, with something to keep our programs running. Only one, you know, because we've been working with such a shoestring budget because we volunteer. And everything that I know about the women's mosque movement and the inclusive mosque initiative has been on a volunteer basis. And people have either paid for things out of their own pockets or raised the funds in order to be able to have them happen. So in a way, you could say that the inclusive mosque initiative is the poor people's mosque. So that's just been my experience, but that doesn't mean that the other point that you were raising, and that is, it is the privilege of those who have the resources to choose their own identity as feminist or not, and to create certain opportunities. But for me, the main thing is, do you have access to knowledge in order to build your knowledge?
Thank you so much for engaging with that question. It might have been might have been slightly provocative. So, Tanya, would you like to ask a question, please? And please unmute yourself.
Still Tanya, not coming through you.
Yeah, we're not able to hear you, Tanya. We're still not able to hear you.
You may need to check the settings under your microphone. I know for me, I choose one microphone and one camera and not the microphone that's here. So just check. There should be like a little arrow or drop-down menu that gives you the settings, and then you can check to make sure that you know, it's not being picked up by, you know, your phone or something when you're on your computer. These things are so fickle. I'm not trying to say I'm an expert. In fact, my tech assistant came to the door and I'm like, no, we're not working today.
Tanya,
text message. Were you able to resolve it, or I don't know if there's a chat in this particular format? So
there is.
It's right at the bottom, Tanya. If you can just.
Tanya, maybe you could leave that question and I could ask for you. And in the meantime, maybe I could ask a question of my own. This is to do with, oh yeah, Dr. Amina. Okay, Dr. Amina, please go ahead.
No, please go ahead. I'll after you. You know, I just don't want to lose any opportunity if the time permits.
Yeah, I mean, you know, this is an honor, so I think we're all sort of clamoring to ask our questions. Dr. Wadud, you know, this thing about ijtihad, where critical reinterpretation is possible. I was just wondering, like, you know, the Sunni judges in the 10th century, if I'm not wrong, sort of said that, you know, there should not be any critical reinterpretation of Quran, that should be disallowed. But I was wondering, because ijtihad is about reasoning for yourself, it's about independent reasoning. What is the role of imam, and what critical intervention do female imams make?
Oh, lovely question, actually. So first of all, let me just say that ijtihad is not personal opinion. Ijtihad is a technical term in the law. And it stems from its root form jahada, to a certain effort. So the belief is that Allah knows best, Allahu alam, and that everyone else who is postulating their understanding, their fiqh, their understanding of these postulates, is subject to potential error. So what they are asked to do is to assert their, in this way you could say personal, to assert their personal best to find the best answer, interpretation, application, parameters, restrictions, etc. But it is an assertion that is based upon access to the sources. So if it's become popular these days to say, you know, it's ijtihad, ijtihad. First of all, ijtihad of the Quran is another sort of oxymoron. We're mixing up a legal term with regard to an exegetical or hermeneutical science. So ulum al-Quran, the sciences of the Quran, are the sciences and prerequisites for the study of the Quran, from which we get a plethora of opinions and also interpretive types or modalities, but these aren't called ijtihad. It is true that some Quranic passages, although there are very few of them, less than 100, some Quranic passages in application to the law require of you an ijtihadic movement into how you will use that text with regard to the matter at hand. So because the Quran is part of the law and legal thinking and jurisprudence, then the Quran will be engaged with ijtihad for that purpose. But that is not the field of Quranic interpretation, which is the field that I'm in. Now I've forgotten the gist of it, just breaking down the word ijtihad in terms of it was used. What was the
role of
point?
the imam and the critical intervention that female imams make.
Thank you. Okay. So this year we will have a volume published on khutbahs delivered by women, since the millennium began. And I think one of the most important aspects of women in the role of imam is deconstruction of the authority and the hegemony that has been taken as part of the canon of Islam. Many people say just to see a woman in that position just changed their perspective. It gave them hope in the places where they didn't even realize they had lost it. And that is because when men and boys, because as boys grow up, they recognize that they will one day have that capacity because it's canon, it's canonical. When men and boys, understand that they can assume that role or that responsibility, it is something that even if they never actually do assume it, it does empower them in terms of their spiritual identities. But when women and girls, they're just sort of categorically closed out from it, they will be the best that they can be in terms of their devotions and their performances. But there is a level of aspiration, glass ceiling, and the message that is encoded in limiting women is a message that is received by both males and females. So everybody thinks that women can only go this high and not further. And if you read Zahra Ayuzi's book, Gendered Morality, you will see this was encoded in the ethics as well. So we need to deconstruct this notion that only men can achieve spiritual excellence. And so one of the first places where we will recognize it is in the public modalities of worship. The other thing, and the reason also why I referenced this book on khutbahs, that I learned this really as a gift from Allah, because the first time that I was asked to step outside of my own comfort zone with regard to the matter of public ritual leadership, which was in South Africa, I was asked to give a khutbah in a mosque in Cape Town, but I wasn't aware that this was in the planning until, like about an hour before the actual time for Friday prayer. And I was younger, or both, And I was 100% dependent upon a paper. It's like I told you, I will participate in this with you, but I'm not preparing any paper or any notes because I've been doing this long enough that I have enough material. I should be able to do it if we organize it properly. So I had no opportunity to think, what would be the best thing to do, this groundbreaking opportunity, blah, blah, blah. And so instead, I went with my intuition. And where my intuition led me was to make a statement about women in labor, that is delivering at the birth of a child, that location is the mark of what the meaning of the word Islam is, which I defined as engaged surrender. Now, I'm the mother of 5 children, so I had enough experience that I could speak from that. However, its alignment with the universal, the overarching articulation of our identities in Islam as Muslims, to use a very female-specific experience as the marker in the public space for that universal was really what was most radical about it. We have continually had the representation of men and men's experiences in the public space, from the minbar, at the mosque, when you go for Hajj, etc., etc. Men are fully human. So of course their experiences are human and their experiences as Muslims are representative. But women are fully human, and their experiences are also markers of their identity in Islam, and in fact of Islam for everyone, whether you have that same physical experience or not. Because that's what's been true for men. The focus on men's specific experience is made as an example for everyone, even if you're never going to have it. I mean, my favorite reference is a khutbah for Eid al-Adha, where the Imam went at length to talk about Abraham circumcising himself without anesthesia. I'm like, that actually means zero to me, not being in a male body. And yet it's part of the public discourse for men, women, and children. So when the reality of women's humanity comes to the forefront of these types of collective devotion, it shifts the ground on the very foundation of patriarchy that we have all been standing on, and it leads to a revolution, really.
Thank you so much. That was a beautiful experience listening to you talk about what Islam means to you. We have a question from a member of the audience. She says, Anisa Fatima, she says, thank you for this enlightening talk. On the topic of queerness, lots of Muslims bring up the Quranic verses on Lat to justify anti-LGBTQ stance. Could you comment on this, please?
Yes, I'm going to have to check my time because this is a really interesting topic for me right now, and I want to respond in a way that's comprehensive, but I don't want it to run away with me because of the fact that it's something I'm working on right now as well, by trying to create a virtual space for queer Islamic studies and theology called KIST. So keep me in your prayers. But the short answer to this, and I think that I probably will go from there to some other comments. The short answer of this is, it is only in the interpretation of Lut that everybody and his brother becomes a Quranic expert. And for the most part, what they are providing is so totally inaccurate to what's actually in the verses that it's almost shameful. The story of Lut is in the Quran, and Lut himself is mentioned maybe like 35 times, but his full story is told in about 7 specific passages. In other words, the unfolding of what was happening there, with him and his family and the town that they were in. And yet, even in the full stories, these passages lead to more questions than they lead to coherence. And yet, there is this popular notion that you can just pretend that there is a clear location in the Quran that is, as you say, anti-LGBTQ. That there is not. There is, however, something happening with particular members of this community. But the Quran does not give enough detail for us to know exactly what is going on. There are no lesbians in this story, and yet the wife of Lut is mentioned more times than the men who come to Ata Rijab Duna Nisa. There is a clear statement about men who come to women instead of men who come to men instead of women. And yet the wife of Lut, who cannot be a man who comes to a man instead of a woman, she's mentioned more times than they are. And yet nobody encodes this into their understanding of the Lut story. What does that mean? What is it all about? Well, actually, we have no evidence. We have the suppositions of the exegetes, some of them referring to other Israeli literature or interpretations of the Old Testament and Jewish Torah before this time, but we don't know. There's no evidence clear enough in the Quran about why she should be featured so many times in that story, from which people come away with a comprehensive statement against all types of sexual diversity. They don't get that from that verse. The verses do not talk about the full spectrum of sexual diversity. So but it's very common to do that. And it's also something perhaps we borrowed from the other Abrahamic traditions that also try to make a sort of, absolute statements with regard to, say, homosexuality, to say, Islam is against homosexuality. And I'm like, who's defining Islam? How do they define it? I don't agree with their definition anyway. So the passages are interesting and they're worth a lot of detailed study, which none of the people who use it like this are doing, and they're probably also not willing to do. But it intimidates most of us. It definitely intimidated me for a number of years. It intimidates most of us because there's no way we can read the story of Lut in the Quran and not come away with a very bad feeling about those who ata rijal duna nisa, those who come to men instead of women. And so the question is, once again, what do we do about it? So this is the second most interesting thing about the way this is popularized versus the way that it actually occurs in the text. There is no punishment aligned with even those men who ata rijal duna nisa, who come to men instead of women. There's no punishment. Allah's divine decree against the town is not a punishment that we as humans can put into place. It's just categorically contrary. It's a earth-shaking, I guess is probably the word I want to use, is the earth-shaking kind of punishment. It is not, 100 lashes or imprisonment or death. None of that is given as the means for addressing what might be a problem, if there is a problem. And so, once again, there are more questions that come from those passages than answers. The other thing is, because the 50 years, almost that I've been in love with the Quran and really focusing on the spectrums of interpretations and sort of the hermeneutics that builds up these interpretations, there's some factors in this story and the rest of the Quran that have led me to evolve my understanding of how we address diversity in our communities. And that's really what's at stake. because the realities with regard to sexual diversity and gender nonconformity, I myself identify as non-binary as well, the realities are such that we have real people who are in these positions. Most of them, coincidentally, are not actually sexually active because of the punitive nature of our responses, to Islam and sexuality, which is a problem not just for, same-sex or, bisexual. It's a problem in the heterosexual location. But most of them are actually not sexual active, which literally is the only thing that the law can address. What is your activities? But the reality is that they're more and more in our communities. And the second reality is that they're actually more and more accepted as part of our communities. So I have gay members of my family, and they've only ever been members of my family, and that's all. I don't treat them as if they're not a member of my family because they have a sexual preference beyond the heteronormative majority. And so we do in the Muslim context. We have Muslims who are in every orientation or none. I myself am in none, that's why I identify as queer. I'm involuntarily celibate for, maybe, 20 years or something, a lot of years. And the reality is that creating an environment that aligns with the Quranic principle of karama. لَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. We have created the human being with karama. Creating an environment of karama, to me, is the highest principle in relationship to gender identities that we are not activating. Women are not safe just to walk down the street. No matter what their gender location, just to be in a cis, female body is you're in danger. So when we want to address comprehensively what is the dignity of the human who is a sexual being, it is a ruse for us to distract ourselves from the comprehensive problem and to pretend that the problem actually rests with people who are gender non-binary, who are gender non-conforming. That's not where the problem is. And we are not addressing the problem because we have an excuse. The excuse that we have is that there are openly gay people in our community, as if being openly gay was worse than being a pedophile or whatever other things we do have in our communities. So when we're looking at this story and we're trying to get a black and white answer, the first thing that I need to emphasize with as few details as I was able to provide here is that this is an entire gray area. So when I get to the gray area, I will use the guidance of the principles of the Quran, which is, taqwa, moral consciousness, karama, dignity, as the guiding rubrics of understanding. And I will leave a space for people working through their gender identities, whether they work through them and enter into heteronormative marriages, or they work through them and they stay alone the rest of their lives, or they work through them and they have a partner of trans or same gender, whatever. I will leave people to work through that as they also confirm their devotion to the ultimate, to Allah. That's why I said earlier that the inclusive spaces are the spaces that have really confirmed for me and helped me to grow my faith, because people are struggling. They're struggling to be in their devotion, because there are people who say you can't be gay and Muslim, so you can't come in this mosque. Who wants to go into a mosque that's exclusive like that? I don't. So the whole notion of an affirmation of the dignity of a human being, irrespective of if they're Muslim or not Muslim, if they're rich or they're poor, they're male, they're female, they're non-binary, whatever, that notion to me is a priority that we have not assumed appropriately, that we should then become expert interpreters of the Quran to be able to say, these passages are there and that means whatever people try to say that it means. So for me, it's very complicated. And yet at the same time, it has become very motivating, to the extent to which I remember 20 years ago when it used to be the litmus test was who could say the word homosexual in a public space and get away with it. Just to say the word, as if, to say the word somehow you're going to be complicit in some crazy, act. I remember that, and I remember it even for myself, sort of my hesitance, my reticence or whatever. But I'm not at that place anymore. And because I'm not at that place anymore, and because I'm old enough that I can see the grave, I can see the shadow cast over that grave already, I've decided that from here forward, I would rather die supporting my queer Muslim friends in totality than to side with someone who maybe has more money and privilege and could do other types of things. But that's a very individual decision. However, whenever you ask me about these questions, I find myself pretty much on a location where I can only express I don't tolerate some other location to determine my actions forward, because it has not been easily won. There was a lot of work by queer Muslims to allow themselves to enter into their own sacred remembrance when they were being castigated by all of these armchair Quranic specialists, because for some reason everybody seems to think they know the meaning of the Lut passages. So that's a roundabout answer. There's a lot more that goes into it. I always say more than I do on other questions for this one because the short answers will not do. We've been silenced with regard to a real conversation for so long that the short answers will not do. Everything else I've been answering for, X number of years, and I can give a short version, but that one there always takes me a little bit far afield.
Thank you, Dr. Wadud. We have another question from an audience member. Taru asks, thank you from Queer Muslim. Money plays a huge part to provide inclusive spaces and message. It seems that the conservative message has a lot of money behind it. How can we counter this?
Yeah, this is a lovely question based on my experience with having witness the development of these spaces. And that's why I say that I used to tell people, if you build it, they will come. But every one of the spaces that I know of that have been constructed, and I've had nice experiences with a lot of them, some of them are not fixed spaces. They are just like rented spaces for an event. Like once a month, they will try to have a collective Juma or something like that. And as such, these spaces have so much more heart that I realize that what it takes in order to do it is not so much money as it is heart, because sometimes you will have to operate on a shoestring budget. But people who decide that they want to do this, all you need is 3 people. You can have a Juma with 3 people. And what I have seen is that if you just say, we can't do this every week because we can't afford a space every week, or we're in my friend's, attic apartment or something like that, like we're making a space out of the space that we're in. If you start doing it intentionally, first of all, you will receive the backlash, so get ready for that part. But the second thing is there are other people who want to participate. It used to be that inclusive spaces were called queer spaces as if only queer people were there, but actually they become spaces that everybody starts to feel welcomed. And that's been one of the most heartening things about watching this movement. All of the Muslim women's mosque spaces are not as inclusive as the inclusive spaces are. Some of them, I hear about the woman in Germany who say if you wear niqab, you can't come in or something like that. So some of them even include other, cisgendered females for arbitrary reasons of politics locally, because there's always politics locally. But you don't need money to serve Allah. And you really have to believe that. If you don't believe it, if you believe that everything is based on money, then you will be distracted whenever there's a glitch, because there will be glitches. But I know that, for example, the organization Sisters in Islam, which is now 30 years old and has a lovely, office and, numbers of employees and all this kind of stuff. But I remember when there were just 8 of us, and everything we did was done on a voluntary basis. Um, I remember that experience because the momentum to do it was really based on our own locations and not based on, excess resources. I don't think that the reality of the conservative monies. This is my opinion on this, and this is, you can kind of hear me out on it because it might sound a bit naive, but it's also based on something. There's so many ironies sometimes with the development of Islam. So, starting with the Arabian Peninsula and, down the pike by X number of hundreds of years, all of a sudden oil is discovered underneath those lands. And then they become like wealthy in the modern, sort of decadent way in which we understand it. Sometimes I think it's kind of funny because, that resource was always there, but it didn't, on the global market, it didn't come to mean what it meant until, our current time, our modern times. And so with that money, they are promoting conservative Islam in other places. They bring the money to Uganda, or they bring the money to Bosnia, or they bring the money to, Chechnya, whatever. They bring that money. Then Muslims who want to build the mosque will accept that money, not knowing that the hand of the devil is on that money as well. And it starts to skew the Islam towards, their, ultra-conservative location. But if you are amongst those places that refuse that money, it will take you longer to do the same thing, but uh, there'll be a pride in what you have done because it will be by the sweat of your own brow. So it will take work for us to construct spaces, but it is not impossible, and so we shouldn't give up. And again, even if there's only 3 of you this week, and then you look down the road and there are 30 of you, the fact that you go for this from the heart of the inclusion means that you will have a better chance at what it would take to go the long haul. Because if somebody just, pushed money towards you, that doesn't make that place better, right? So, you don't want to get distracted by thinking that money solves the problem, because it doesn't. It creates its own problems. Whereas if you have the heart of the matter, whether you have the money or not, the matter will be affirmed at a much higher level, so that when there is money, you'll be better able to use it to promote that which is in the heart. So I wouldn't emphasize the money again. I would not emphasize it. I would not give it that much attention. I trust that the energy of the heart is more valuable than anything you can have in your purse. So that's my location.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wadud. I am pleasantly surprised and so heartened that most of your talk has been so positive and hopeful. So it gives a renewed sense of enthusiasm about where feminist politics is heading. I just would like to apologize to everyone here. We are running short of time. So if you please don't mind, maybe we could club the last 2 topics, which is new knowledge production and questions of authority, and lived realities as evidentiary basis for Islamic justice.
Yes. Well, the good news is I did make a few comments about the authority, and we kind of will want to make that work, except to add to it that We need to stop looking at authority as a kind of hierarchy and privilege, and instead look at it as what I call the democratization. So the democratization of authority in Islam follows that the picture that I gave, that every participant in the congregation is potentially its imam and its khatib. You need to experience this really sometimes at the spiritual level so that you understand what I mean, because I have been in places where, there are people with a considerable amount of expertise, knowledge, community experience, but the idea that they would stand in front to lead the prayer or stand in front to give the khutbah just overwhelms them. Just overwhelms them. And I'm old again. I keep telling you this. I love to see someone just being so transformed by the experience of embodying this role. So I always tell people, I pray most of my prayers alone. So I'm the imam of my salat, every day, because, I try to pray every day and I'm pretty much alone every day. So I'm the imam, in other words, I try to deconstruct it, that this is some special position with only certain people can fulfill. When we take that away, what we've done is we've deconstructed the hegemony, the kind of hierarchical authority, and we've reconstructed community as a collective of souls, all of us striving towards our Lord. But it also has something to do with the production of knowledge and how how we gather evidence. What are your evidentiary basis for asserting certain locations and opinions? So I'm going to jump from that to this notion about the lived realities as an evidentiary base, because it also is a story. It's constructed around certain things. And we know that legal opinions, when they are developed and eventually become, authoritative in the community, they have followed certain steps. You can study these. They're, part of the fiqh and usul fiqh, and they're also a part of, other sciences and ulum. But what's interesting is that it is clear that people have what you would call expertise. They have knowledge. And so if the jurist, who may be well-versed in the Quran and the Hadith and the Sunnah and the different usul of the fiqh, if they want to understand the legality or permissibility or prohibition of a thing about which they don't have expertise, they have to consult with an expert in that field. So say there is a new medical procedure, cloning, or what you call sort of stem cell corrective surgery, right? For the jurist to make an opinion on the Islamness of this thing, they need the evidence about what that thing is from the experts in the medical field. And what we have understood, and actually this is a lovely thing, but I'm going to kind of rush through it, having to give that example to take you to where I want to go. What we've understood is that we are social beings, and muamala is a part already of the usul fiqh, of the classical jurisprudence and the like. But because we are located in societies, the experiences in the societies determine whether or not those societies are achieving its goals, whatever they may be. And in the age of development and human rights, from UN, et cetera, things are measured along the lines of the well-being of the human that have something to do with their human rights, and it has something to do with like resources. Okay, so We know that certain things, for example, like child marriage, that child marriage statistically, that is, the evidence concludes from the comprehensive study of the impact of child marriage, is such that it leads to higher levels of mortality among, especially maternal mortality, and also mortality of the infants. It leads to lower levels of education. It leads to additional poverty. It also tends to be, for some reason, more highly associated with violence in the home. So we have this evidence. And so this evidence is a counter argument to those who try to justify child marriages on the basis of other evidence, especially since this is mostly evidence from another time and another place. We know that oh shoot, I'm sorry, give me 1 second. My maid's at the door and she didn't bring her key.
So just to recap it for the audience, Dr. Wadud is now speaking about new knowledge production.
Sorry about that. I normally don't lock my door, and so it's funny that two people showed up, my tech assistant and then my maid, and maid has her own key, but she didn't bring it. I just sent her to the back, but I forgot that door is locked too. If we want to achieve certain principles that are parts of the value of Islam, for example, justice, then we need to measure the impact of certain social norms and practices on the ones who are, a part of that experience. And we need to use their lived realities as the evidentiary base for reform, especially in things like Muslim personal status law. So this is something that Musawa.org is online. This is something that Musawa has been doing as a movement for reform in Muslim personal status law. And that is using the expertise of community advocates with regard to actual lived realities in the communities to determine whether or not the implementation of something that supposedly is in the name of Islam is achieving its Islamic conclusion. So just like we use medical experts to determine whether or not a certain thing should or should not be done in Islam, we need to use the evidence of these social advocates about the lived realities of Muslim women and queer people, really, to determine whether or not we are achieving what is the excellence and the best of Islam. And when we are not, we need to make adjustments in order to make sure that the evidence that we have gathered is used as part of the knowledge base for determining the right path. So I hope, that's the thumbnail version of it. I still have to kind of like give you the medical example first, because it used to be that what women experienced in communities was just personal. In fact, sometimes too personal to be included in the formula. But what I'm saying now is the formulas, as they are marked by the principles, justice, honor, dignity, equality, integrity, and the like, that those things can only be measured by people. But you can measure them. And one of the ways that Musawa works is to collect lived realities, sort of human stories, and to use those in order to articulate the impact of certain policies, to indicate or to provide the evidentiary basis for saying that these policies are not achieving the goals that they say they are about, and they are counter to the overall principles of Islam. It's a very, very interesting development in terms of the women's movement.
Thank you, Dr. Wadud. We now throw open the discussion. Dr. Sagar, Sagar, if you have a question, could you please direct it to Dr. Wadud?
Yes.
Thank you.
First of all, Assalamu alaikum. Professor Adud, I'm a great admirer of your writing and lectures, and I have been working, researching on the British Muslim fiction. Okay, so I have consulted some of your books and lectures. Thank you very much for some for a brilliant and enlightenment works. My question is that uh, a 14 centuries old consensus, I mean, by Islamic religious authorities, uh, has upheld the belief that God has granted husbands the right to beat their wives. Uh, Previously, the only element up for the debate was the degree of severity, the instrument
Right.
of the beating, and the
Right.
limit to the damage allowed. Would you please throw some light on this verse? I mean, 434 of the Quran that has been called the DNA of patriarchy. My this is my
DNA
first
patriarch. Right.
this is my first
Um,
question,
yeah, yeah. Your first question
and
is
the
a
second,
dissertation. Your whole
yes,
question is a thesis. So if you have a
yes, and
second
the second,
question, why don't
yeah,
we start with this one and see whether or not we'll still have time?
and the second question is that since the holy book Quran is an open-ended, then
Sagar,
who will be? Yes, yes. Just a minute. Then who will be held responsible as the apt custodian with regards to translation of the same?
Okay, so 434 used to be one of those things that sort of kind of like undid me in my efforts to work through the Quran. But I've moved beyond it, particularly in the second book, Inside the Gender Jihad, chapter 6. And I think
Yes.
if you really want a thorough answer, you will want to look at it because it is complicated. Just as it took us centuries to get into this problem, we will not get out of it in just one single stroke. However, the main focus is to understand that the methodology for the implementation of any Quranic verse or chapter is a constructed method. And when we see the elements of the construction of how do you put that into implementation, when we see the elements, it is possible for us to move beyond the literal articulation in the Quran towards the trajectory of the Quranic revelation. I used to interpret, and in my first book, Quran and Woman, I used to interpret it by kind of playing around with conditions and nuance. But by the time I worked on this in lived realities long enough, again, remember I just said about using lived realities as a marker for whether or not we achieve Islamic ideals and principles. Having looked at it, then I became very clear that under no circumstances should this verse be put in application in real life. So no, cannot. And the journey to get there was not easy because a faith position tells us that you can't say no to the Quran. And yet at the same time, I am a descendant of African peoples who were enslaved in the Americas, and slavery is not condemned in the Quran. And there is nothing in my being or my history or my DNA that could possibly get me to say that slavery is okay. It may have been okay at some point in history, but the experience of my ancestors is such where it's comprehensively not okay. But it's still in the Quran. And so that's when I understood that we live in an interactive relationship with Allah. That's part of being a Khalifa. There are species who operate only out of instinct. Um, most of them quite fascinating, what is the instinct? I mean, just the world of bees sometimes, just be surprised some of the things that happen with them as they swarm around a single queen. Man, there's something going on in that community that's just amazing. But humans have this sentient capacity, a capacity to reflect on things that are not present. That is a capacity to think about before we were born, where were we? And after this life, where will we be? We have the capacity to think about that. And when the Quran also addresses this in the form of its own discourse over Alim al-Ghaib, the unseen, it only increases in us the awareness that to have that capacity to think beyond just immediate reactionary functions, at the same time requires us to make that application, that is ijtihad, to exert our best efforts to come to an understanding. There is no child who has been raised in a household where the father beats their mother who cannot tell you what's wrong with it. No child. Even if they later on, they become all reactionary and they become serial killers or whatever the heck it is as a result of this kind of violence in their early life, whatever. But then again, we have to learn to understand live reality as an evidentiary base for determining moral excellence. And so we have a partnership with the Quran. We are not recording devices that simply mimic those words again. We are multifaceted, multi-sensory beings who have been given the amana. We've been given this trust from Allah that we will come to this earth and fulfill our khilafah or our agency, which is in fact an assertion of our excellence. So it is possible to have a much more dynamic relationship even with explicit Quranic text. And there are very few places that you would need it as much as you do for 434. As far as translating the Quran, I think you have something specific in mind, but let me just say that because of the history of this particular text, starting as it did as an oral transmission, being written down as it was revealed, and then being consolidated into a single manuscript only 1 year after the prophet to whom it was revealed, upon him be peace. We have had an active relationship with the Quran that has spanned our technologies. So we have the ability to, to copy an entire MP3 of the Quran onto our devices in less than 30 seconds, right? But this wonderful facility does not take away from the fact that we also have an intimate relationship with the Quran by way of our performances and by way of our cultures and by way of our own spiritual aspirations. So there are layers to the Quran, some of which new technologies will present us with alternative opportunities, but none of them will take away from it as a source of inspiration. Inspiration for what? Inspiration to achieve the highest moral excellence of our being on this earth. And you can't do that by any one translation or by one MP4 device. So we will continue to be fascinated by these new technologies that will facilitate much, but we will continue to, for example, memorize the Quran to perform our prayers or, other events, in our lives and the lives of our families and communities, right? So the Quran, in a way, keeps its original verbal articulation at the same time as it interacts into countless numbers of translations and or countless numbers of sort of technological advances. So for me, it is a simultaneous relationship between the text and the human that will allow us to maintain its integrity in all kinds of new scenarios, some of which we cannot even imagine.
Thank you, madam. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Wadud. We have one last question from Dr. Amina. Dr. Amina, if you could please unmute yourself and ask.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity, ma'am. Here is just a quick question since we're talking about knowledge production. As a theologist, which primarily you are, ma'am, I'm interested in knowing your position or how do you locate the huge corpus of hadith or the sayings of the Prophet, may peace be upon him, which has been historically and traditionally one of the major means of Islamic knowledge production and dissemination at the same time. And it also then happens to be one of the, it inevitably becomes part of supplementing Quranic verse and understanding them so much so as that it even is being used to ascribe for someone to have a complete faith. So I would like to know.
Yes, so for me, the love that I have for the Quran was a gift from Allah, because I came across the Quran 5 months after I took my Shahada, and I fell in love using a translation that I can't even read it today because it's so gender biased, but I fell in love and I just said, this is it, and now 50 years later, I look back and I say, and it was, because I've made my whole life around this text and it has brought me such deep joy. But because my expertise is in Quran, I've been accused of being anti-hadith, which I'm not. It's just not my area of expertise. But the Quran could not exist without the Prophet, upon him be peace. So there is an interrelationship. And I definitely believe that the Prophet's obligation as a Rasul was to both convey the message in words and to embody their meaning in his practice. So I definitely think he is a guidance for us. And I refer to the Quranic description, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاهُ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. I have not sent him except as a mercy to humankind. So because we're, sort of over the time, I'm going to give you the, the sort of the auntie version that I have of this. Don't let anybody turn you away from the Prophet by putting really foul words into his mouth. In the process of hadith collection, the reason why they developed their methodologies was because there was a rampant tendency towards falsification. And they wanted to ensure that, these things were not falsified. But the interesting thing is there's so much beauty in the Prophet, in his personhood, in his words, and in his practices, that whenever I come to these things that people use in the most negative and nasty way, I know that it's not the Prophet, it's them. And the history of the statements that they claim were said by the Prophet, they've all been contested. There is no negative statement for which there hasn't been a copious amount of research done, usually showing that it does not have the strongest siha, which is the measurement of the goodness or the quality of the hadith. So I'm not deterred anymore by negative statements on the voice of the Prophet, because I do know that they're a tool that's used in the hands of people who have hate, and that's unfortunate. And that's why I say, don't let anybody turn you away from the Prophet, because the kinds of things that the Prophet said that really soothed the heart, and the kinds of things that he did that was funny, he had such an interesting sense of humor. And the kinds of ways in which, my favorite thing of the Prophet is recently in some research discovering that he lived in a woman-centric world. He had no father, he had 2 mothers, he had 4 daughters, He stayed in a monogamous marriage during his youth and the height of his masculine strength, monogamously with Khadijah for almost 25 years. If we have a way to reshape the image of the prophet away from those people who say the most nasty things and put it in his mouth, then we can once again be re-empowered by exactly the rahmatul alameen that Allah has identified him to be. So when you see those things, and when I hear those things today, the first thing I think is, oh, this person has a really negative, attitude about women or even about the prophet. I don't ever let it deter me from the prophet, because just like those few passages, really, there's like, 4 or 5 passages in the Quran that you really have to go into the details to really try to understand exactly what does this mean along that trajectory of justice, equality, and dignity, etc. Just as those passages exist and have to be worked on, there are these statements, but they are never, ever the bulk of what the prophet left us. And for us to let the prophet's legacy be sidetracked by these fools is something we just have to nip in the bud. Just don't do it. Don't let them do it. It doesn't mean that as far as public discourse goes, that it's not going to be out there. But one of the jobs, I mean, you guys are particularly, as an association of research scholars, you guys as a dedication towards knowledge, and knowledge is power, but knowledge is also produced. So we have to become a generation that produces the best of Islam for the next generations to come. And that means that we need to stop giving up our energy to people whose agenda is only harmful. They're not worth it. There's so much energy that you can put into constructing the good and creating, more and more open spaces and affirming the beauty and the dignity and the harmony that is Islam. But it is work, because we have been waylaid not just by enemies of Islam, but we've been waylaid by other Muslims. So even though hadith is not my area of focus, and I don't make as many references to it when I start talking about methodology, because I'm using methodology based on my particular area of expertise, I have made my relationship with the Prophet based on the light and Nur and Muhammadi, and I refuse to let it be put into darkness by other people. So that's a possibility for all of us, really.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wadud. We have a very young scholar here with us, Tanya, who has been trying to ask a question. If you have the time.
If you have managed with unfortunately, I tried to send my maid a text message, but my language is perhaps not good enough. She didn't get it. Yes, Tanya.
Do you think it's okay if Tanya could ask a question?
Ma'am, am I audible to all of you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum, ma'am. Rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Walaikum salam.
Yes, it's really fortunate enough to have you in front of me, and thanks to the moderator and everyone, Sagar Ali, who mentioned my name and I was added, and to be here sitting in front of you and listening patiently to every word you have said. So, ma'am, basically, I have done my master's in English literature, and while doing so, we were reading literary theory, like for example, post-colonialism and all the theories that we study. Semiotics and all, I understood something, that all their bases are from the western part of the world, France, Germany, Russia, formalism, structuralism, and everything. So I was really, I had this inside me that when I was searching for a perspective that I was not getting, very honestly speaking. So after completing my master's, I sort of thought of, I tried to revise myself and think deep, and I realized that, am I only a Muslim by inheritance? Did I only inherited Islam as a religion? And I really tried to revise myself and go deep into it, and slowly I found a perspective. perspective I received, I started looking at literary texts from Islam, from the perspective of Islam. For example, ma'am, I'm just detailing a bit. I mean, excuse me, I'm apologizing from before because I'm taking this bit down. For example, I have been looking at Old English texts where there are quite existential questions related to existential crisis, and I felt that the Quran is able to answer those questions. And then there were poems which invite couples or young people to directly act in zina, something completely against the Islamic tradition. And ma'am, I have been thinking that to develop my thesis or my research later on this perspective, which I don't know I should exactly call the Islamization of literature or knowledge undertaking. But ma'am, my basic question, yes, ma'am, my basic, I'm basically in a fix. I don't know that whether I should if I should read the Quran as a primary source or a secondary source, and should I know Arabic in detail, how to move on, should I do another master's in Islamic studies to move ahead with my research, or can I? So, I'm just honestly speaking, I have it in my hand.
No, no. I love it. I love it, actually. Let me just say that, whatever amount of knowledge we get in this life, it is a drop in the bucket to the amount of knowledge that exists. So the more you pursue, you will not always come out with answers. Sometimes you will come up with more questions, as I'm sure you have already discovered. But a couple of things you brought up I do want to address really quickly. And one was that, this post-colonial studies, comes from, France and Germany and, these kinds of places. And we need to move beyond the location that says everything that's good is with, brown and black people, and everything that's bad is with, white and male and, whatever. It's never like that. So there are many good things that have come, from the West or the North, or with however we're dividing it. There are many good things that have come, but because we are sentient beings, we must reflect. And our power of reflection, not uncommonly, will lead us to more questions than answers. But eventually we may come to answers, at least, that will satisfy us until we need to change our response to that thing, because to me, knowledge is never stagnant. So I would recommend something else. I would recommend that you focused on a project from beginning to end and discipline yourself to the completion of that project, because knowledge never ends and you will always find something more, and that is never going to, I mean, Quran and Woman came from my dissertation. I literally tell people, don't do something like that for your dissertation. It's instead, just think of it as a long research paper, because what you want is you want to get the PhD in hand, so then you can worry about your magnum opus. So that, I mean, I'm completely saying don't do what I did. It wasn't the smartest way to do it, but alhamdulillah, I did get done. The other thing is the Quran as a source. The Quran as a source, well, first of all, it worked very well for me, alhamdulillah, but it doesn't for everybody. But the thing is that the Quran as a source is most profound in its own language. The wisdom of the Quran can be portrayed without language, but as a source, it's most profound in its own language. However, we are writing in English, or Urdu or Farsi or Hindi or Tamil, or any number of languages that we must use within our institutions. If we're not writing in Arabic, we've already borrowed. And to make certain ideas clear, we are going to, as sentient beings, we're going to think through our own sort of hermeneutical field, which is going to be wedded to our languages and may not be related to Arabic. So I never tell people you must learn Arabic and that everybody must learn Arabic, or you must learn the Quran and everybody. No, I never say that. But the Quran is an interesting resource, and if you can build a competition to the problematic passages that you were finding, looking at this other literature from the West, via one of these Quranic principles, it does make for an interesting resource. And so you can do that, without Arabic, and you can do that without becoming a Quranic scholar, et cetera, et cetera. But I say that after I have said what I said before. If you really want the Quran as a source, there's no way to beat it in its own language, But I can't simultaneously tell you, put a ending to these projects, so that you may take up other projects in full, rather than to make one project piggyback onto the other. The one thing about the World Wide Web is it tells us everything is connected. So of course it's going to be connected. It's going to be connected through you. But for the sake of coherence, we must learn to put a cap on a task. And please don't use the word Islamization, only because that had a phase at the beginning of just before the 21st century. It didn't turn out well. It turned out very conservative, and now it's defunct. So use something else. Base it on one of the principles, in the Quran. You could even say a Quranic reading of justice from the perspective of dirada versus karama in the Quran, dignity or something like that. So, but just for me, don't use the word Islamization.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wadud, for engaging with our youngest participants' questions. And also, I have to thank you for engaging with all our questions and really getting into the nitty-gritty of it. Thank you all so much for participating in this, I have to say, thrilling lecture that I've attended, most thrilling lecture in recent times. I'm sure you'll all agree that when I say that it was an honor to listen to someone as eloquent and articulate as Dr. Wadud, an authority on all things Islamic feminism at the intersections of sexuality, gender, class, race. And it is certainly not an exaggeration to say that listening to you speak about engaged surrender and other aspects of experientiality with rapt attention was a spiritual experience in itself. Thank you for speaking to us about something so complicated and peeling it layer by layer with such academic rigor. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the president of AIRS, Ariba Esmat Mozam, for inviting our eminent speaker, Dr. Amina Wadud, to deliver this lecture. I thank Dr. Wadud for taking the time out to do this and engage with all our discussants' questions. I thank all the members who have worked tirelessly to make this event possible. We at AIRS are grateful for the support, enthusiasm, and determination of the speaker, discussants, and participants, and the whole team, AIRS. Thank you. We hope to see you all tomorrow, August 7th at 11 a.m. to attend Professor Muhammad Omar's lecture on popular sovereignty and its discontents. Have a great evening ahead. Till next time. Thank you, Dr. Wadud.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.